Lots of vetoes that were never overturned. You know, we ran a tough ship and did a good job.
Let me say this, and I cannot help but compare and contrast, so pardon me for doing so. After 24 years in the system and seeing it not only as a treasurer but a state rep and a state senator, you really understood the wheels of Colorado's bureaucracy, and I think you knew how to play those levers pretty well. Ritter, while I think a very good man and a guy I would trust to babysit my kids, I don't think he's ever seen the inside of working of state government, and I feel like for the first few years it was on-the-job training. Let me talk about a couple of these things, including, for instance, the executive order he put in, bringing collective bargaining to state workers. This was something that I think is going to have a detrimental effect. I can't imagine you did this. In fact, you did a very different executive order that was very quickly replaced, which had to do with payroll deductions for state workers. Tell me a little bit about that and where you think we're going right and wrong.
You know, one of the first things I did, and we did it in a way, it took about 1.5 years to set the legal stage, but we stopped withholding union dues from state paychecks. I didn't believe that it's a legitimate function of government to use taxpayer money to go out and collect dues for big labor. I still don't. We stopped it. I stopped it by an executive order. We were immediately sued by labor. We defeated them at every court. My successor, Governor Ritter, chose to reverse that policy, and so the state of Colorado is now collecting union dues. I don't think it's a legitimate function of the state. And myself,
you didn't say that government workers couldn't join unions or join any political cause they wanted. You just said that your our government wasn't going to be the bills collector, the collection agency.
That's exactly. We don't collect money for the Democratic Party. We don't collect money for the Republican Party. We don't collect dues for the Chamber of Commerce. Why do we collect dues for organized labor? Well, I think you and I both know the reason. Once you sign that card the first time, it makes that $200 or $300 or $400 that's taken out less noticeable. And we know for a fact that if a union has to go out and sell itself every year to its members, we know A, it doesn't like to do that because it likes the automatic renewal, but B, it makes it more responsive from my standpoint because they're having to sell themselves every year to their members. So I saw it as kind of a good government move. I don't think the taxpayers ought to be subsidizing labor unions, and I thought it kept labor unions closer to the people they represent.
10 years ago, you were able to come in with the first Republican governor in 24 years. You had a Republican House, you had a Republican Senate. Now, 10 years later, I'm looking at it, and it's completely flipped 100% the other way. Even the federal delegation has flipped 100% the other way. And my hat's off to the left for putting together such an incredible strategy, not only a terrific plan of building different organizations that pushed ideas and voter registration, not necessarily politicians, and then a whole bunch of organizations that pushed politicians. Seeing the state change, why did the state change in your point of view, and what's your concern about that? Or at this point, you and I have had these conversations. You still love the state and you're concerned about the political direction. What do you think about how Democrats took over, number one, and then two, what's the real danger? What are you worried about?
Well, I think part of it was national. I mean, at the same time Colorado was changing, so did the U.S. Senate, so did the U.S. House, and so did the U.S. President. All of those used to be Republican, too. All of them aren't. So to one extent, Colorado is simply a microcosm of what we saw nationally. But secondly, and perhaps equally as important, the Democrats had 3 or 4 millionaires and or billionaires who chose to really buy into this process. You know the people, Tim Gill and Pat Stryker and Jared Polis and Rut Bridges, and they invested $20, $25, $30 million into legislative races, into setting up an infrastructure for the Democratic Party, and it's been very successful. I can name you 10 legislative seats out of 100 that have flipped because of the monetary advantage that the Democratic Party has. Throw in also organized labor, which knows exactly where it goes to get its views known. And you have the Democratic Party having a 2 or 3 to 1 advantage financially over the Republican Party, and you have a national trend that has been damaging for us. Yes, we had, you know, in the last 10 governor's races, the Republicans have only won 2 of them. and both of those were the ones that I won. This is a state that's had Floyd Haskell and Gary Hart and Pat Schroeder and Tim Wirth. It's not a state that the Democrats, I make the argument that this state's always been a battleground state. It isn't a Republican state that's gone Democratic. You look at the state in the 70s, it was a Democratic state at the top completely, and the legislature was Republican. All of the elected officials in Colorado essentially were Democratic in the 1970s. We can do better. We need to work on our message. And we also had some challenges nationally in terms of some of the scandals and some of the failure to perform in the way that we expected.
But we're looking at something that's very different even than the 70s. Yes, well, let's see, the entire delegation sans two to Washington, D.C. are Democrats.
Right.
We've got a secure House, secure Senate Democrats. We've got a very liberal governor. We've got 5 Supreme Court justices that were appointed by Democrats. You were only able to get 2 in your years there. We're seeing a huge shift change. I don't believe that represents Colorado. I have a feeling that represents a lot of frustration with the Bush administration. I think it shows a lot of frustration with Republicans, but it also shows the money issue that the Democrats, and the strategy that they were able to put their money into all sorts of organizations that would nitpick here and there, and were rather effective. How do Republicans get it back?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that politics runs in cycles. You look at 1964 with the Lyndon Johnson great landslide, and in 66 the Republicans came back, took 47 seats, took the presidency in 68. Then look at 72, the Nixon landslide, 49 states to 1 if memory serves me correctly. And then in 74, Democratic landslide. 1992, a Bill Clinton presidency with Democrats in both House and Senate. 94, Republican landslide in Congress. These things shift very quickly. I don't know if the stimulus package is going to be the beginning of perhaps a shift. It's a bad package. There are good components to it, but it is a welfare package that every Democratic program that couldn't stand the light of day in terms of an up or down vote was put in because they could hide it in that stimulus package.
You and I had a pretty sizable disagreement on referendum C and D, which was to put a 5-year timeout on the taxpayer Bill of Rights, but that was a public vote. So we took our fight not only to this show, but all over the state, and we duked it out. And you won on C, I won on D. Correct. You got the better part of that deal, but I'll let that go. The Democrats in the legislature now have changed the way money is going in by a mill levy freeze. This was something that the governor called euphemistically, I believe, the Children's Amendment, and we now have that in court. In other words, instead of asking permission for another $4 billion, as you did with referendum C, the idea is we don't need to ask. We've already asked.
Take it.
There's also talk of changing what's known as the Byrd-Arbuscow Amendment. This is the 6% growth limit that we have in Colorado law. It's been constitutionalized by Tabor, and there's talk now of somehow switching that, and without a vote of the people again. And I think these might be interesting arguments to have, but one, thank you for having the respect of the people to go out and ask them permission before you change Tabor. But how do you feel about what's going on right now?
Well, I'm opposed to it, and I think you've outlined it correctly. I think that the Democrats have gone, and the mill levy is in court, but this is a very liberal court. With all due respect, this court is very political. It's very liberal. I don't foresee them reversing that several $100 million tax increase that the voters,
$100 million a year, and it only grows up every year
exponentially. And thanks for pointing that out. Secondly, Byrd-Arbuscow limits Colorado spending to 6% a year, and you know the exceptions. Anything above that goes to infrastructure. Essentially, I'm rounding. They want to do away with that so that they can get the money into social services, into current consumption. They being my friends in the Democratic Party, don't like money spent on infrastructure. They want to spend it on union salaries. I'm paraphrasing here.